Hey guys, I just want to talk to you. This is Chapter 1's lecture for you on the communication design principle. So I'll try to be a little brief. Make sure you read the chapter. Just want to kind of highlight a few things for you. So I'll try to keep this under at least 10 minutes for you this time. I know the other one was longer, so I'll try to make up here. One of the quotes that I pulled out of there was, one cannot not communicate because every behavior is kind of communication. People who are aware of each other are constantly communicating. Any perceivable behavior, including the absence of action, has the potential to be interpreted by others as having some meaning. The first sentence there, one cannot not communicate, is really a huge eye-opener. Even just sitting in a chair in a classroom, you're communicating to the instructor, to the students around you as to whether you're paying attention or whether you're not paying attention. If you have your phone in your hand and you're looking down the whole time, either you're distracted or you're busy or you just are aloof and don't care. And maybe that's not the intended communication, but that's something that comes along. So there's always nonverbal communications. And some of the studies suggest that 70% of our communication is actually nonverbal. 30% is what we say. So when we start talking about user interfaces, one of the things we have to understand is that everything in our user interface, everything, the color, the texture, the design, the drop-down menus, the commands, all of those communicate with our end user, whether A, our user interface has it together or not, or B, how simple or how understandable all of those pieces are. So always keep that in the back of your mind. Even when you think you're not communicating, you are communicating. So the goals and the objectives is to establish baseline principles of intuitive user interface as a form of effective human communication, and distinguish attributes of intuitive user interface for both individual interactions and entire tasks, and to assess typical user behavior to determine how well designs communicate. The word intuitive in these goals and objectives is important because a lot of us will say, well, that just user interface just isn't intuitive. But there's reasons why it's not intuitive. So just throwing out the word intuitive is not enough to explain what is the problem with it. Even so, when you say a user interface is intuitive, we have to describe exactly why we think that user interface is intuitive. And we'll talk about those words in just a few minutes. Contrasting communication, there's people to people, and then there's communication through technology. Through people to people, the conversation is usually natural, friendly, and use of plain language. It has goal-oriented or results-oriented. It's very purposeful. We carefully explain why people need to do things. You can think about it as a kind of a boss explaining to an employee. I had a student employee stop by my office the other day, and he came in. He had something. It was natural and friendly, and we used plain language. We didn't talk in acronyms or something complicated. In addition, his purpose in stopping by was very goal-oriented or results-oriented. He had a question, he wanted an answer to the question. In which case, my response to him is also goal-oriented or results-oriented because I want him to do something. So I explain what he has to do, and oftentimes I try to always explain why, because people usually understand better why why they're doing something. They're more apt to do it. They're more motivated. It also follows a person's mental models or natural workflows. If I were to give this lecture without a PowerPoint, it would follow a very different order. It would kind of be as things kind of came to me in my head. Right now I'm using the PowerPoint to just kind of structure what I'm talking about. And usually people-to-people communication is pretty simple and very to the point. Whereas through technology, it's very different. It's very unnatural. It's using technical language and tone. It's tech or mechanically oriented, which might be a problem for some of the end users who are not tech or mechanically oriented. It usually, 9 times out of 10, bad user interfaces always follow the code. They don't exactly follow the natural flow of conversation or what we would do. And it's usually overcomplicated, and it usually labors over very unimportant details, where we're collecting information that there's no reason why we need that information. We're just putting it in there so our data, we might need it some other day, 3 years down the line, in which case it's probably outdated anyways. So principle number 1, you have to understand, going back to what we started with, even when you think you're not communicating, you're communicating. The user interface is all about the communication of the tasks at hand. So that's very important to understand. User interface is more of a communication study than it is anything about coding or any of those things. Of course, code and the program will kind of dictate how certain things might have to get done, but it should really be more about the communication aspect. Principle number 2, your user interface should explain tasks clearly and concisely as you would in person. Not overly complicated paragraphs to tell you to put in the state in which you live, or why it's important that you're collecting the state. It should just simply say state. You don't have to say, please put the state that you live in. We already know what those mean. Every user interface element can be evaluated by what it communicates and how effectively it does that job. There's a picture here of very simple tasks that are usually used in the iOS user interface. And one of the things, you can look at each of these and understand what it's doing. Even the stars that are highlighted there, if I can find my mouse, here it is. The stars indicate that you'd be rating something. Your username, this one is a little unclear, but turning something on or off. All of these kind of highlight that for you. Watch trailer now, and we also know that this little, on the end of this little capsule button, that's a drop down. We know what this is, just kind of different view settings. So you get the idea, and when they're commonly used, don't recreate the wheel. Don't try to develop different buttons when users already know the ones that they have in their user interface. Always be polite, respectful, and intelligent. It's not polite or respectful to make the user feel less than, or to feel like it's so overly complicated that they couldn't possibly do what their task is set out to do. It's also not respectful to over-explain things. If you're developing complicated software for purchase orders that accountants are going to be using, you don't have to explain accounting steps. Maybe you, when you're designing the user interface, have to study those and figure those out. But usually the accountants already know those, so it's really just kind of walking them through the steps. It's not intelligent to give them too much information that they might already know, plus they might be insulted by that. If a user interface feels like a natural, professional, friendly conversation, it's probably a good design. That is always true. So when it kind of walks you through that logical step, succinct to the point, then you've probably got good design on your hands. The definition of intuitive is one that kind of we struggle with. User interface is intuitive when the target users understand its behavior and the effect with the use of reason, memorization, experimentation, assistance, or training. Now, the goal in good user interface design is to try to eliminate the need for a large amount of assistance or training, even the user manual. Apple stopped giving out user manuals with all of its products because they've designed their user interface that it almost doesn't need one. So that's kind of the goal, is to kind of put the trainer and the technical support people out of business when you're putting the user interface. Now, there will always be a need for them because there are always users who are going to not get it correct or who are going to overinterpret and those types of things too. So that's natural. But the idea is you want a majority of your users to think that this is so simple that they don't even need those things. There's an interaction life cycle. So the first thing someone does is they determine the task to achieve a goal. And then they find a starting point and they initiate that task. Then they execute the tasks and subtasks. They review their overall results. And if they're satisfied, they move on to the next task. So if you think about it in shopping, if I went into Target and I needed to buy cat food, the first thing I would do is I would decide, I need cat food. So therefore, I'm going to go to Target. I get into Target and I find a starting point. I grab a basket and I say, the pet section is over in the back corner of the store. So I start heading towards there. So I find a starting point and I initiate that starting point. I find the cat food. I place the cat food in the cart, and maybe while I'm there, I find some other things. Those are the subtasks. So I then maybe make a few other purchases. And then I move on to and review my overall results. Did I get what I came here for? Yes, the cat food is in the cart. If I'm satisfied, I move on to the next task. That other task might be purchasing something else, or it might be going and checking out and going back home. And then the cycle repeats itself. So I'll determine a new task, and I'll try to reach that goal. The same thing is true in user interfaces. There are certain things in here. Now, these are all what describe intuitive. So instead of using the word intuitive in this class, what I want you to use are words like discoverability. Can I easily find something? Understandability. Can I easily understand what they're asking me for without large amounts of experimentation? Affordance. Affordance is trying to figure out what the buttons do and what the expected outcome would be before I have to do that. Or being able to find things. The predictability. Am I able to predict what's going to happen or what they're going to ask for in the next screen, and what what I can do all the way through? The efficiency. How efficient is this? Am I asking you for your address on the first screen, and then also at the end I'm asking you for your address again? Or do I have a button where I can click and say, use the same address I get provided for my the shipping address is the same as the billing address, and then I don't have to re-enter all that information. That's very efficient for your end user. And that's true. That's just one example of many different types of efficiency you can add in. And does it provide responsive feedback? So if there's an error, does it tell them how to correct the error? Remember back to the first lecture that we had, we showed that error message that the end user typically could not understand. Also, does it respond back and say, you know what, we're missing some information here. Can you provide this for us? Forgiveness. If I make a mistake, can I go back and correct that mistake? Or is it just locked in and then I have to call on the phone and tell you that my order is incorrect? Can you please correct that? That's not easy. So you want some forgiveness in there as well. Explorability. Am I able to explore the user interface and try to figure out what's going on in there before I actually start some subtasks in there? Those are all the things that actually are combinations of intuitive user interfaces. So instead of saying this is intuitive or not intuitive, these 8 things are the things that I want you to analyze going forward in this class. Now, this chart comes straight from your book, so I encourage you to look through this, but there are design attributes that make it intuitive. It's automatic, nothing for the users to do. It has all the appropriate intuitive attributes. The usability outcome is it's fully intuitive because users can achieve their desired outcome without experimentation, assistance, or training. Now, very few things fit in that intuitive category. Most of them are in the usable category, and some of them are even down a little further than that. We've all seen usable interfaces, and I'll go back to DataView. All of you have used DataView. DataView is a usable interface. It's learnable and it's guessable. It's not exactly fully intuitive. It's not sensible. It is trainable. It's a little confusing, so it has some unusable characteristics to it. But it's, the documentation and training are enough that it requires very little assistance or technical support. Usually some experimentation and guessing will get you through. Most of the user interfaces you use are in the usable category, usually in the mid to low end of that. What we're striving for is that green bar. It's hard to get to. You have a responsibility to the users when you're designing user interface. You want to make it clear what your program does and how to do the task, what the options are. Make your user interface worth the time and effort. Design the user interface for users to easily answer questions quickly and confidently. You want simple, standard, intuitive, self-explanatory, and consistent. Users are usually focused on their work, not on, and I'm sorry about the typos here that I'm seeing, not on learning how to use your user interface. Users' time and efforts are precious, so don't waste them with unnecessary tasks. And especially if you have users on mobile devices, you want those to be very simple tasks because they won't give the time to it, especially if it's a website that they don't need to use to complete a task. If they can go somewhere else, they'll go somewhere else who have better user interfaces. Users won't complete a task if they lack confidence. So always make sure that you give them the confidence they need throughout by making it simple and understandable. And that's a hard task. If we go backwards one, getting into that green bar is not an easy task. So that's what we're going to actually work on in the course. Please read chapter 1. That will give you way more detail than I've given you, and then we'll work from there. So see you later. Thanks for tuning in today, guys. Thanks.